Welcome, everyone. My name is Jennifer Heldman. I'm with the NASA Ames Research Center. And this is the SSERVI Analogs Focus Group. It's run by myself and also Tim Glotch from Stony Brook University. Hey, Tim. Tim and I have been running these seminars through the focus group, and we'd like to thank SSERVI, the NASA's Solar System Exploration Research Virtual Institute, for sponsoring this focus group, where we can bring together people with mutual interests regarding terrestrial analog research. And this seminar is actually special. This is a crossover event across focus groups, because this is also relevant to the EDIA focus group, the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Accessibility group. So thank you all. You may have heard about it from one of the two listservs. If you are not part of one of the focus groups and you'd like to be, you can send me an email. I'll put my email in the chat and we can get you signed up for the Analogs Focus Group listserv and or the EDIA Focus Group listserv. So today we are very honored. Thank you. Savannah Mandel is here with us to speak today. She's a PhD candidate in science and technology studies at Virginia Tech, and also has the very awesome title of outer space anthropologist. So I will file that under categories of careers I didn't know you could do when I was a kid. So thank you, Savannah, for coming and giving a talk. And also I'd like to say that, you came to us, you actually gave a similar talk to NASA's History Office. So I'd like to thank the History Office for working with us and enabling us to have you come and speak to these groups as well. So that's great. So without further ado, her talk title is Earthly Analog Sites and Arctic Peoples. So Savannah, I can hand it over to you and you can take it away.
Yeah, and I just want to say, really special thanks for the invitation from both you all and the history department for inviting me to do this talk, because my interest in analogs has always been really kind of passion project, tangential to my primary research. And so to get to do to have further discussion on it and to work with NASA's history sector, NASA's a group of people also just really interested in equity, diversity, in analogs. It's just been really fun. So often I'm stuck in the policy and government relations and business development arena, and to get to be with you all, it's just great. So it's just been a real fun thing. But I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Yeah, so I thought I would just start by kind of giving what is a real necessary introduction to myself, my work, and what it means to be a space anthropologist. Though I think some of you might be familiar with work by anthropologists who research space, because some of them have worked with NASA. I got into work on outer space when I conducted field work at Spaceport America during my first master's degree at the University College London. I ended up going to New Mexico and working with Spaceport America, where I studied ideas of risk and sacrifice. And I was there for pretty much a semester. And this was right before Virgin really started launching. So it was interesting because it was a very transitional time period for them. But it was also interesting for me because space anthropology, I mean, this is a subsector of anthropology. It's a subfield in the same way that environmental anthropology is a subfield, or biological anthropology is a subfield, and should be taken seriously in that way. But that being said, it's not a big subfield, right? And it is growing, steadily growing, but it was really interesting to begin studying it, studying this space from an anthropological perspective 5 years ago, because it was still growing and still emerging, and really just started emerging at the end of the 90s, give or take a couple stray books on space and culture that were published in the 80s. But really, this body of literature on anthropology and space started to come out in the early 2000s, in early 2010s. Some of this you guys might be familiar with. Janet Vertesi's work with NASA, her really most prominent book, Seeing Like a Rover, where she conducted research on the Spirit and Opportunity rovers. when they were in development, and looked at how NASA engineers anthropomorphized rovers, left behind politics and ideas of humanity in robotic creatures. So I used to say creatures, but robots, right? And then on the left, we have an image of Valerie Olson, who conducted research on with NASA's NEMO missions off the coast of Florida when that was active. And she went on to do research with NASA and other capacities and other variants of space research as well. We also have work in space archaeology, which has been funded by NASA for a really long time. That often looks like satellites being used to look at archaeology sites from above, and we can learn a lot more about what can't be seen from below. So Alice Gorman and Sarah Parsick have used these techniques to study pyramids in both the Americas and in Egypt. And they've uncovered like thousands of pyramids beneath the sands of Egypt, right? That like will never be dug up because they don't have the manpower to do it. But this is with the help of space technologies and has long been funded by NASA. And then you also have Lisa Mazzeri's work with NASA when Mars was first being mapped on Google Maps. And she also looked at things from a political standpoint and how Mars was being framed in a certain political way as democratic and as available to all, and how this reflected certain cultural beliefs and values. And I just wanted to kind of show you some of the work that's being done by other anthropologists in the field. My original field work. Now my work is extended in many different directions, which I can talk about more at the end of the talk, but I can give you an idea of what's being done. And then I started getting interested in analog sites. I mean, I think first because purpose-built analog sites are just kind of cool, right? Like there's this mysticism to them and this like awe factor of like people going and living in these really like wondrous environments built to replicate space here on Earth. And you hear about these missions and like biosphere, and like it amazed me. And like I started looking into it and doing research. But then at the same time, I was looking at purpose-built analog sites. I was learning about indigenous populations who already lived in extreme environments on Earth. And it was really weird to be studying the two at the same time, to be studying, say, like the Mars Society's analog site in the Arctic, and then also to be just studying Arctic peoples at the same time, and how the two looked really different. And like, what could we learn from both of these? Like, it was just like, and why did the two ways that populations existed in these extreme environments not quite marry or match up? I started to ask, could naturally occurring analog sites be alternatives to costly purpose-built ones? Might they be just as valuable in terms of research applications, if not more valuable? Like where was there a gap in the research that was being done? Were there pockets of knowledge that could be examined and individuals that could be learned from when we were looking at populations living in extreme environments? Now, before continuing this talk at all, I do want to make a note about ethics, right? Which is really important. And that when you're talking about doing research on indigenous populations, which is which is technically like what I'm talking about, right? I really want to carry with us this idea of like nothing about us without us. You know, before NASA has gotten, and other space organizations, right, commercial space organizations, have gotten increasingly better about including indigenous and diverse voices in conversations about space. But these organizations also have legacies about leaving these voices out of the conversation, about, you know, like there being a lot of tension between the two. We can look at like the arguments at Mauna Kea and the histories of arguments at Mauna Kea tracing back to the 60s. as an example of this. And so it's very important to carry with us as we start to think about, well, how can we start to learn from existing populations here on Earth? Well, we need to make sure that before we are doing research on them, we're doing research with them. You understand? So there's a huge difference there. And we can adopt decolonial methods to help us learn to do that. And that's a whole other conversation on how you do that, adopting decolonial methods. But I just want to say, like, I am acknowledging that that's a big caveat here in this conversation. I want to go back. So what alternative analog sites am I thinking about? Well, I wasn't just thinking about Arctic people, so that's a really prominent one in my mind and one I'm going to talk about primarily in this lecture. But I was also thinking about a couple other sites. So one, we see sites where populations have lived in extreme environments for millennia. So you see indigenous populations, not just in the Arctic, but the desert, the jungle, ancient populations as well. Think of ancestral Puebloans. So that's the Anasazi, like the Anasazi cliff dwellers. You also as well have isolated populations. So as in, and like isolated populations, you might not think of isolated, but who deal with the same stressors. So island cultures, remote populations, crewed vessels, jobs worked in degrees of isolation, such as park rangers, mail carriers. There's even been research done on like teenagers in rural communities. Rural as in like population 300, which in many cases, I mean, that's a lower population than McMurdo Station for a lot of the year, right? And so what can we learn from the literature that's been written on that, on like rural communities and the absence of technology in those communities in the current day, and how that affects teenagers and growth and social networks. As well, though, industrial sites, high stress sites, team-oriented populations. So looking at, of course, the military, but also things like oil rigs, hospitality industry workers, fishermen, and then examining alternative social configurations beyond what we typically think of when we're looking at a social system and an analog. So thinking about communes, crush style child rearing, different tribal hierarchical structures, examining different sexual and reproductive structures, even looking at other like systems of eating practice or ritual. And I'll get to that a little bit more in later parts of this talk. So this was the sort of the four main types of alternative analogs that started to really like, I was thinking about a lot. So for the main body of this, I do want to talk about Arctic peoples. I think it's just a really fascinating case study. And one reason it became fascinating case study for me was because when I was in undergrad, actually, I took a course on Arctic peoples, and it was extremely well taught by a professor who did his field work in the Canadian Arctic. This is an image from his research with the Ulahuqtuk peoples, and it was just, I mean, it was incredible. We learned about the Canadian Arctic, we learned about the Greenlandic Arctic, and pretty much from like the 1960s to the present. And this professor and I really formed like an ongoing relationship, even as my research really drifted from his, and he did field work with them for like 20 or 30 years. And I remember at one point I sat down to interview him. I wanted to ask him about what could space scientists learn from Arctic peoples. And one of the first things that we talked about together was in situ resource utilization. So this was like the first lesson he told me, because the first question I asked him was, okay, well, like, how do Arctic people survive in these harsh environments? Like, how could astronauts learn from them? And like, how could like space organizations, as we, construct habitats on the moon? And this professor was like, okay, let me stop you right there, because the first thing that an Arctic person would tell you is that these habitats, these environments are not harsh. Like, get that word out of your vocabulary. Like, they're not harsh. They do not see these environments as harsh, you're already coming in with a huge cultural bias that is like fogging the way you're thinking about a social structure in this environment. When an Inuit person looks at the Arctic and they see a bountiful, lush landscape. I mean, when I looked at the photos he showed me, I saw ice and snow and blue sky, and that was it. But when he pulled up those photos for class, he'd be like, look, there are fish and seal and migrating whales under this ice, and each one of those animals has fat and meat and bones and fur that they can harvest, right? The water becomes ice, the snow becomes something you can pack on, help you heat things with. You can fill your canteen with that. There's plant life hidden underneath the snow. You can make an igloo if you need to. There are birds in the sky that you can catch. Like he just went on and like on about like all this richness in the environment. He talked about the minerals and the earth and like the soil and like just everything that could be harvested from the land. And he also talked about the fact that, you know, indigenous beliefs when it came to living on the land, we're not living on the land, it's living with the land and moving with the land, you know, until very recently, a lot of Inuit populations were still nomadic. So they were moving seasonally. And this was really important in terms of resource utilization, in terms of sustainability. And this was a big value in how they thought about resource utilization, you know? And how does this translate to space, right? Because you can sit there and be like, well, that's great and all, but like there aren't seals and birds and fish on Mars or Moon. And the first thing I'd probably say to you is, okay, like I know this is gonna sound like I'm a heathen, but like maybe Moon and Mars, not the best choice for us. Maybe we should wait for a better planet with better options for us in terms of resources. But the second thing I would say is how this translates is it translates to when we're thinking about building structures on other planets, utilizing the resources at hand and using them in a sustainable way. So in other words, you know, making sure we're prioritizing use of regolith, making sure we're thinking about like the minerals available to us, and is nomadicism something that needs to be considered, like factoring in these things rather than living off of, you know, these however many frequent trips back and forth from Earth that they're not sustainable. That's not a sustainable lifestyle if we're thinking about extraterrestrial living. And so like that's the belief system that needs to be carried with us. And if it's like the philosophy he was trying to explain to me was like, if we're not ready for it now, then maybe we shouldn't be going. And that's what the Inuit would say to humankind trying to go to space. So that's sort of part one of what could be learned from individuals who have lived in these harsh environments their whole life. Part two is about avoiding conflict. There's a weirdly large body of research on how Indigenous Arctic people avoid conflict. Now I say weirdly large because I guess I wouldn't think about how much acknowledgement there was for the strategies of managing tension and anger and frustration and sadness and repression. And but there are. And what we see here, this image is an example from a great documentary that just came out like last year, but of a dance battle that we just used to relieve tension. But as well, there's been a couple books about anger and how the anthropologists who did this research talk about how they felt like they had so much anger compared to the Inuit people they were studying when they were there, that the Inuit people just didn't express anger. They kept it internal. And from a very young age, they taught their children not to express anger and to be very empathetic and to be very accepting of each other. And there are really good reasons why. And I have a great story to demonstrate why, right? So this one anthropologist tells this kind of funny story where she said that, this was in I think the 80s, and they were living in an igloo still, and it was 10 of them, and there was a 2-year-old, and the anthropologist says this two-year-old's awful, like constantly throws tantrums, just like the worst kind of 2-year-old. And one day the 2-year-old's throwing a tantrum, and anytime this kid is throwing a tantrum or like wants something, the nearest adult immediately gives it to them. And finally, the anthropologist says to the chief of the family unit, like, why are you doing that? Like, you're just spoiling her. She's not going to learn her lesson if you just give her what she wants immediately. And the chief took her aside and was like, listen, like, you don't understand. Like, there's 10 of us stuck in this igloo for the rest of winter. If we do not give this child what she wants and stop her from crying, and we just let her cry until one of us goes crazy from it, the person who goes crazy is going to kill the child. So we're preventing a death. And like, that's what he said. And it's this moment, he's like, we're preventing like further anger and frustration by just pacifying the child immediately. And there's this idea of like this kind of like instant pacification, but also teaching about morals in other ways through storytelling, through sort of like the child learning about it on their own. So kind of like letting them like play near the fire, so to speak, and if they get burned, they learn from it rather than having another human being tell them. But it's interesting that there was a lot of existing strategies about how they work together to negotiate violence and anger and frustration, because it was very understood in these settlements that anger was a poisonous thing, super, super poisonous. And this documentary that just came out as well, like really acknowledges that in the present day, it's still like a personality trait that is really just like frowned upon as being one of the most like dangerous to society is anger. It's just really unhealthy. But then as well, you see in Arctic communities extremely high rates of suicide and depression. So I mean, we could analyze this further, I think. But I do think it is worth, when we're looking at anger, it's important to look at it, right? Because we see, for example, when we read histories of biosphere and the memoirs from the individuals who were in there, how there was immediately social factioning to a really petty extent, and how much anger there was and how much frustration from people who had known each other and were friends for ages, and how that anger was not moderated and not taken care of, and they didn't have any social structure at hand to negotiate that anger or tension at all, and how difficult that was for them. And then you saw that as well as the second round of biosphere, and you see that as well in Arctic bases, like Antarctic bases, where there's been several people who have gone on to do interviews and talk about how there was extreme frustration and tension and aggression and anger that was not managed. And this is going to be, these issues of tension are one of the biggest issues to be negotiated when we think about the establishment of colonies. So exploring how Indigenous populations who have lived in harsh environments have been, or people who live in just isolated environments, negotiate this frustration is huge. I'm going to talk about that as well at the end of this lecture in like a totally different context. But yeah, there's that. And then the kind of last point that we can take away from Arctic people specifically is re-examining cultural values and beliefs we bring to outer space. So asking, what should an extraterrestrial society look like? What cultural values and beliefs do we build one on? And this is a really big question and like a really hard question to answer, I think. In anthropological training, they teach you, not to try to be unbiased, but to be upfront with your biases when you go into a field site. And it's a difficult thing to do, but I think part of this question is starting to think, what factors and elements of sociocultural structure are at play. So in other words, we're looking at not just infrastructure and design, but religion, politics, economics, family, food, sex, architecture, language, infrastructure, design, tradition. So, for example, we've seen disability scholars talk about this and push back against the way that space stations have been designed in an inherently ableist way. Um, Even how the ESA's call for astronauts could be pushed even further. Um, and for example, you can look at how food is a really excellent example of a sociocultural kind of system that we think, okay, how should meals be served? Should a crew be pushed to eat together? Should they be allowed to eat separately? What would a food psychologist say? Well, maybe in American context, a food psychologist would say one thing, but perhaps in a Polynesian context, a food psychologist would say another thing. There are many cultures in which men and women still don't eat together, or certain parts of a family unit eat together, but others don't. Or there are some units where eating on your own is considered a sign of depression. Again, pulling from like biosphere, food was a huge psychological issue. Some food had to be locked away for fear that the people were going to eat it. Who cooked and how they cooked became a big point of tension amongst the crew. So looking at these aspects is important, but looking at these aspects from a non-Western angle is even more important, allowing flexibility and how we experiment with different social dynamics in these spaces. That's what I want to kind of deconstruct. And as well, asking questions like, in these societies, will there be currency? Will there be privacy? Will there be raised beds or chairs? I mean, that's a design question that's like super Western, right? When we think about that, will there be raised beds or chairs? Or will we just sleep in the ground? Will the society be monogamous or polyamorous, communist, socialist, democratic? Will art be promoted or considered a waste of time and resources? And so how do we pull in new knowledge systems and deconstruct old ones as we answer these questions? We can think as well when we consider the example I gave about storytelling and how in Arctic peoples use storytelling as a method of explaining morals. Storytelling is an interesting example when we think of Australian Aborigines, because storytelling in Australian Aborigine culture has been used for map making. So we can think about like, is this a process that could be used to be adapted in case of emergency, like teaching astronauts to use storytelling so they remember maps in their heads in case maps are gone. And how it works is like the Australians would tell a story and say, oh, the bird flies westward over the tree to get to this, and it's a way of telling you like how to go home if you don't have a physical map in front of you. Or using tactile interfaces in case the lights go out, and teaching astronauts Braille. So in case the lights go out and then you don't have any way of knowing what button's what, they have a tactile interface that they're familiar with. And I wanted to return now. So we've looked at the case study of Arctic peoples to thinking about a couple more examples that some of us might have had experiences with in our personal lives. So I love the example of hospitality industry workers as analog environments for looking at team organization under high stress environments. My interest in this stemmed from, I did research on it. I've also worked in the hospitality industry since I was 15. I still do. I work at a brewery right now. And I actually did work specifically on pacification and anger and mediation of tension and rage. And I never thought to connect it until this moment, actually, to this idea of Inuit rage. Actually didn't. But when you look at a restaurant, it's kind of fascinating because you stick a bunch of random people, right? These are not chosen people. They're chosen because they have maybe worked in a restaurant before and can do their job. They're meeting very minimum qualifications. Let's be honest here. And they're all put into a really high stress environment with high risk of energy. When you work for a large corporate high volume restaurant, like I have in the past, you see people getting third-degree burns every single week. Every single week. You're also seeing worse injuries like people getting their fingers cut off and arms crushed in the ice machine or getting electrocuted. It's serious burns, serious injuries. But you see that very, very quickly, almost without being told how, like these innate structures of tension negotiation, teamwork, building, some of which you are taught to, but not like in a manual. It's like you're taught just by working in the industry over the years. So for example, a language adopts. That's really crucial to people's safety. So if anyone has seen the bear, that's why I have this picture here from the bear. You've seen them say words like heard, behind, corner, up, down, like shoulder. And this is to tell you where your body is, tell them where your body is in relation. So the reason why you say corner when you're going around a corner is because a lot of times your hands are full and you don't want to risk going around the corner and hitting someone else. You could be carrying like a pot of hot oil or something. And you also, like when you're working behind like a bar, I work at the brewery and we have like 5 or 6 people behind the bar. You have to constantly be saying behind, down, up, right, left. So everyone knows where everyone else is at the bar, because elsewise we're going to be slashing beer on each other all the time. Or you're going to break a glass on someone, which has happened, right? The minute someone does not say corner, you run into them, or someone slips and gets a really serious injury. But this language that is adopted for safety in high stress, high intensity environments, when we think about that, we can think about it with like scuba divers as well. Scuba divers have adopted like sign language for underwater, for in case of emergencies, to let each other know things that are happening. Think about this in like analog sites, like adopting these practices, but also not just like with language, but how you can put 15 to 20 people in a restaurant who may or may not like each other, right? There's some people at the job who hate each other. Their personality types never going to get along. But somehow this intense loyalty develops where it's like it doesn't matter if you like each other or don't like each other. You learn to like have each other's back, like to go to war for that person when the rush hits and there's a ton of people on the line, and we shouldn't underestimate the sort of labor that's going in these moments. Like if I wear my Apple Watch on a busy shift, it tells me I've walked 10 miles that night going back and forth, right? Like you're doing a ton of movement and a ton of work, and you have to be able to help the other person immediately if they need help without them even saying anything. Sometimes you just need to know, like to be able to sense in their body movement that they need help, that they need you to do something without them asking. And it's this sort of team structure that's very curious because it's not that intentional. And we could say it is hyper designed in some ways, especially with corporate restaurants. Like there are mechanisms that make it work. But I've always wondered, like, how can we apply this to astronauts in space, right? Like, I think about that a lot. But I'm going down a tangent. I also think about, oil rigs being a really good example for this, and in very similar fashion. You have, again, far more isolation again, high stress, high intensity, but high cohesion, extreme team building. And of course, the idea of Antarctic bases. I think I was talking to someone the other day about how teams are teams are designed on Antarctic bases for overwintering when the base has a much smaller population. And it was really interesting because I was talking to the German Antarctic station about this. And the guy who directs it, told me something very different from any other like American base I had heard, where he said that they tried many different configurations for overwintering and like their social population and demographic structure. And he said they tried an all-female team, they tried an all-male team. Those went horribly wrong. He said it has to be co-ed, but he said also that they started designing their team around the surgeon, because the surgeon's kind of like the most not replaceable person on the team. Like the surgeon, like the surgeon's job is just so unreplaceable. Like you can't call them up on Zoom and tell them how to do a heart surgery if necessary, right? But like if the mechanical engineer, I don't know, bites the dust, you might be able to do that over Zoom a little bit easier than a heart surgery. But so what they started doing, not to discredit any mechanical engineers in this chat, I'm sorry. But what they ended up doing was they started collaborating with the surgeon when they were like creating the demographics of the team and putting together the team for the overwintering. They would consult with the surgeon and base it around their personality and take that into a huge consideration. And I just thought that was like a really interesting, different approach to what I had heard before from other bases. But anyway, I want to leave time for plenty of questions. I do have some extra resources at the end of this slide, both on Arctic peoples and on space anthropology research. There's a couple reviews in here on space anthropology research if like you want to look at more stuff. And my socials are on these slides as well. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Savannah. I have so many notes written down for so many different topics that you brought up to think about. If folks have questions that are online live now, I believe you can mouse over your name in the participant list and you can raise your hand, and then I can call on you and we can have a discussion here. I did have a quick question just to lead off. I know you said it's a whole separate talk, but a lot of folks that are on the line and that will listen to this later do work in remote locations and do interface with Arctic peoples and other peoples and other environments around the globe. So I'm just wondering if you have some thoughts based on your experience and research on best practices for interfacing with these communities and what works and what doesn't work as we go out and do different types of research, in these environments where, these are where people live in their homes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best thing you can do is, well, first, always work in collaboration with the communities you're with. I think that's huge. Always go in with an absolutely open mind. One thing I didn't mention that I meant to, when we think about ethics, there's this story of when NASA was doing some tests for the Apollo missions. They were on Navajo land. And so they invited some of the Navajo leaders out to the test site. And in part of their conversations that were recorded, one of the Navajo leaders said, like, oh, this is your first time going to the moon. Like, we go to the moon all the time in dream states and dream walks. And, like these in indigenous ontologies, like the existing relationships with the celestial, with space, with the cosmic, it's really important, I think, to acknowledge that, because I think that is something that has not been touched on a lot in depth. So I think going in to it, assuming like, let's just go into any of these sites assuming like nothing, like just don't have any expectations and just like be completely open-minded, but also be upfront with your biases, like, but just ready to learn. Like, so like, for example, when I went to Spaceport America, my bias going into it was that I loved space, right? That's a bias, like that's a huge bias. I loved space at the time. And so I needed to go into the site being as objective as possible and just being open and listening and exploring all the avenues of the site when conducting field work. And that means not just listening to the people of Space for America, but listening to the people in the surrounding area and the firefighters and the EMS teams they worked with and the people of Truth or Consequences that worked in the cafes and exploring all these different avenues. And, so when you're working with Indigenous populations in areas where you're also doing space research, I mean, it's hard. There's been a lot of research done on this difficulty because so a lot of space projects are now done in like post-colonial areas, right? You have like the ESA spaceport done in like an extremely impoverished country that is struggling with a legacy of colonialism where they don't have the infrastructure. This is in French Guiana, where they don't have the infrastructure to support their cities, but the spaceport is like a luxury place, right? And there's been protests about this, and you have this conflict that is like, it's just so important to be like really empathetic towards that and to like listen and to like understand and like to really recognize what's going on there. And if you're saying like, well, we want to be decolonial in our approach to space work, whatever that means, whether you're doing work in French Guiana or, Mauna Kea or wherever, you need to start by, collaborating with Indigenous people, reading the literature done by Indigenous people, reading the decolonial literature and adopting decolonial methodologies that can be applied to space work, and start there, and I know that like space organizations are starting to do that. And it's getting better, but yeah, it's a hard thing to navigate. I mean, it's just hard. I mean, you want to launch from the equator because it's better, but there's a lot of post-colonial countries on the equator that are struggling with intense poverty. So,
Well, it's great that, people like you and talks like this are bringing awareness to these issues so that, more of us can be thinking about these topics. One other question I had too was, I thought it was interesting you mentioned the ISRU, the in situ resource utilization, because I know that there are folks on this call and listening afterwards who are dedicating careers to trying to understand how to enable ISRU off planet. And it was an interesting perspective that you were explaining how the viewpoint is different, where you see this barren land versus the same land is lush and full of resources and able to support life and civilizations and whatnot. So I'm just wondering if you have any more thoughts or perspectives as we look out into space to enable long-term human presence on the moon, on Mars, et cetera, and how we approach the use of resources to support the humans, and balancing that with the natural environment and how that's approached, in these sort of indigenous populations.
yeah, I mean, I think it's a really beautiful puzzle. How are we going to make the most out of what these extraterrestrial bodies give to us? So whether it's the moon or Mars, how can we make the most out of the minerals and the regolith that are available to us? And I do know like there are a lot of cool companies like that are gonna like 3D print like the regolith and like stuff like that. Like I've seen it, like I think it's awesome. And I want that to be the avenue that we go down as much as possible, because I think that's so important, this idea of like rather than building onto, like you need to like adapt with. And so as much as possible thinking like, well, this is going to be good for the first 100 years, but how can we make a human civilization on another planet sustainable so we can cut back and cut back and cut back those missions from Earth? Because that's what's ideal, right? You don't want to have to be reliant on Earth. And it's not safe either. And so constantly thinking, well, how can we develop Martian soil? If you can, right? Like I mean, it might not be possible. And that might be the sad truth of it. But like having that as the end goal, that sort of sustainability is just like crucial.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we have a thought in the chat too. Um, I'll read it. Curious about what partnerships NASA might build with communities that have centuries long experience in building and using materials in their immediate environment. If you have any thoughts on that.
Um, so what partnerships might be built? Um,
Right. With these communities who have experience in this area.
well, I mean, it can start with something as simple as consultancy, right? Like you can just ask Indigenous people and Indigenous experts on knowledge systems and customs, especially on infrastructure and design histories, to consult for NASA. If you also just Google like NASA works with Indigenous populations, like a bunch of stuff comes up. So look, they have been, but like that's the beginning. It's just like asking for help from these populations, like, hey, we know you have a ton of knowledge on this. How can you help us? Or go find a historian of the Anasazi cliff dwellers and say, you know, how did these people make these mud houses work for as long as they did? And how can we do the same thing on Mars? And do you think it would be a smart choice? And have that collaboration in effect for a couple months, and see if it's fruitful or not. And having those sort of voices in the conversation, bringing in these new perspectives, I mean, I think it'd be really interesting. Even just having a workshop, right? NASA's got workshops on this stuff all the time, but like this would make a great workshop.
That is a good idea.
someone tell someone about that.
Right. Parvati Prim, you have your hand up if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Savannah. This was a really awesome talk. So this is sort of piggybacking off of Jen's question and your response, but so not my own perspective, but some folks might say that the logical endpoint of living with the land is to completely transform a world so that so that we can live more comfortably with it. So for instance, when folks talk of terraforming Mars, for instance, so in one sense, you know, folks might argue that so some folks might see that as sort of like the ultimate expression of colonizing another world, and some might see it as sort of like, well, the logical extension of living with a world. And how do you balance those two? And do you have thoughts on that based on your work?
Yeah, I mean, and that's hard. And I think that's where the nomadicism comes in indigenous cultures, is that they never stayed for a long time, didn't stay long enough in one place to completely restructure an environment. And this was why I know I was just reading a history where it talked about how Native Americans, I believe in the South of America, what happened was they would leave a region, and I think the French at the time, so this was like during French colonization of America, would be like, well, they're gone now, we're going to take their land. And the Native Americans would be like, wait, we were going to come back, like this is seasonal migration, like you don't understand, like we were not leaving permanently, like this is a part of it. And so I think that would be the answer. Now, how do we apply that to Moon and Mars? I mean, and this is looking super long term, right? Because like this is looking at like full planetary development. You know, is migration an option? Is migration something that would even be fruitful to us? Like, what has been the purpose of migration for populations in the past? How has it been valuable for them? Would it be valuable on another planet? Because typically migration occurred to so resources had time to replenish. They wouldn't really be replenishing on another planet. But I mean, so these are things that like would have to be negotiated. Now, full terraforming, I mean, I think it's a kind of what kind of terraforming are we talking about? Are we talking about like agricultural terraforming? And do I agree with full terraforming? I personally I'm very iffy on it. And I think uninhabited places and colonization of them still perpetuate like colonial legacies and are still really harmful to the populations left behind on Earth. I mean, but that being said, we would be looking, I think, at like an agricultural transformation more than anything, unless we actually find a way to terraform planets in the air way, you know what I mean? So that was a kind of a rough answer to that question, but filled in some gaps, I hope.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, these are very big questions that probably require more than 1 hour. But this is great food for thought. I don't see any other hands up. So I think everyone is thinking deeply about these big issues and questions and topics that you have raised. And I really appreciate you bringing this perspective to these communities in the Analogs Focus Group and the EDIA Focus Group as well. So thank you, Savannah, for spending the time to talk with us today. Thank you to everyone who was able to join online. And thank you to the folks who are watching this afterwards after we post this talk. It'll be on the NASA SSERVI website. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and I appreciate you coming.
Yep, people are always welcome to ask me more questions offline as well.